All right, welcome to the Week 4 Forum. This week we are discussing America's racial politics, but we're primarily looking at race through the lens of federalism. To what extent has American federalism, with its tendencies to reinforce existing micro-majorities, creating obstacles to fair treatment for African Americans? Is there a common problem with federal systems of government? Think, for example, of Germany and their treatment of Turkish guest workers, many born in Germany who consider themselves German. Um, if we take seriously this notion of path dependence that I have periodically mentioned in this and other courses, what is the likely trajectory of racial politics in the United States? Given the history detailed in this chapter, what is the likelihood that the United States will ever become a post-racial nation? Robertson begins this chapter kind of discussing the shooting death of Michael Brown, an unarmed African-American man who was shot and killed by a white Ferguson, Missouri police officer on August 9, 2014. This shooting in a suburb outside of St. Louis is more than 4 years ago now, resonated strongly with African Americans who have long felt their members were targeted by police officers with deadly force on a disproportionate basis. Similar to the 2012 shootings of Trayvon Martin, the Brown shooting provoked a storm of media coverage, which led to rioting and protesting of African Americans in Ferguson in the days after the shooting. According to a Washington Post story, each of the last 2 years, police have shot nearly 1,000 people. I leave it to you to figure out how many of them were African American. What does this story highlight about race in the United States? Robertson describes racial politics as the American dilemma. And elsewhere, I've heard, American racism characterized as our country's original sin. Why is the status of racial minorities so fraught in American politics? How does federalism shape politics as it applies to race in America? Robertson commits a good deal of space to laying out the political and cultural foundations of American racism. Southern culture in particular was committed to providing a biblical justification for slavery, organized itself around sort of suppressing the potential for slave rebellion, and certainly politically committed a great deal of effort to protecting the institutional status of slavery. Given the South's commitment to an agrarian economy and towards increasing intolerance of any criticism of their peculiar institution, how did federalism further intensify the growing sectionalism of the mid-19th century and kind of create sort of the pretext for the Civil War? How did the outcome of the American Civil War resolve slavery as a legal political matter? The issue that the federal government, or the fact that the federal government imposed a 14-year-long period of reconstruction on the former states of the Confederacy, kind of suggests a serious commitment on the part of the federal government to reshape the basic political and cultural institutions of the postbellum South. How effective was that effort to change the South? Let's briefly return to the issue of police shootings. In 2016, Tulsa went through a similar trauma to what happened in Ferguson when Tulsa police officer Betty Shelby shot and killed Terrence Crutcher following a traffic stop. Now, obviously, your perspective may vary, and at first blush, many people look at African American complaints about police shootings and they say, well, that's a local problem. I think the problem is much broader than that and reflects a national problem. I think a working solution to the problem of police violence against African Americans would require meaningful commitment from both from all levels of government, federal, state, and local level. What do you think? Is a solution to police shootings a top-down solution, or is it a bottom-up solution? Let me ask a simple question. Are police departments required to compile and report statistics on officer-involved shootings? Are police departments required to pull from such data the racial composition of each shooting? If you do some research on gun-related violence and police-involved shootings in particular, you find that the statistics are often pretty sketchy. I will add one more question for you to consider as of a yes-no variety. Did you know that the Center for Disease Control the CDC, is forbidden by law from conducting research into gun-related deaths? Contemplate why that would be the case. Just think about it within the context of this course. We have a widespread image of America as a melting pot. Race is one of those issues where that melting pot metaphor really doesn't go very well. How does reading this chapter affect your view of this melting pot metaphor? Is it logical that the first black president in Barack Obama would be followed by the election of somebody like Donald Trump? How did federalism help, to produce the nativist birth or resentment-based political movement that got Donald Trump elected? How much did racial tensions contribute to the Trump movement? I think in this chapter, the role that Woodrow Wilson played in nationalizing de jure racism in employment and other areas is one of the more shocking things I learned from reading this chapter. We tend to think of Wilson as a progressive, and we have a particular image and assumptions regarding what it means, what it has always meant, to be a progressive. That image and those assumptions can lead us into error as it relates to the history of progressivism. Yes, Wilson was a prominent member of the progressive movement. Yes, he was a trained political scientist. Indeed, he was the first and only political scientist, professional political scientist, elected president. But he was also a Southern. He was a virulent racist. These days, you don't see many leftists who are also racist, but that doesn't mean they never existed. Several questions from the weekly study guide deserve our attention this week. For example, if we accept that constitutional systems tend to produce a kind of pendulum effect, where do you think that our politics regarding race is headed? What factors contributed to the Republican Party's evolution from a party of racial liberalism to a party of racial and economic conservatism? How would you assess the current state of race relations in the United States today? Given that a large percentage of white Americans believe that racial discrimination is a thing of the past, while large percentages of blacks and other minorities continue to report experiencing racial discrimination, does race continue to be a significant factor contributing to political polarization? Students who, having read the article for the short writing assignment by Richard Rosenstein, if you want to discuss how racial discrimination helped create the powder keg in Ferguson, Missouri, please feel free to share your thoughts. For me, I was shocked at how blatantly racism directly guided so many policies at the federal, state, and local levels until quite recently. And my second impulse was to get really mad and to think how un-American those policies are. My views on what constitutes un-American have evolved somewhat since then. I read a powerful presidential address to the American Political Science Association by the late Judith Shklar. The address was given like in the early 1990s. She was the first female president of the American Political Science Association. She was Latvian born, one of many Latvian Jews whose family fled the country when the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states in 1940. Her family ended up in Canada, and she attended Harvard, where she also earned her doctorate, and was so exceptional as a teacher that Harvard hired her in 1956, when faculty positions at Ivy League institutions were still male-dominated. In her presidential address, which was on American political thought, she said that it was a misnomer to assume that the American Constitution was an experiment in democracy. Instead, she claimed that America was a dual-track experiment. On the one hand, the Constitution launched an experiment in republicanism with some democratic impulses. And on the other hand, the Constitution launched an experiment in authoritarianism. When we think about what constitutes American values, however we conceive them, I think we should always be mindful that there has always been an aspirational side to Americanism, but there is also a dark side. And, obviously, there are a lot of related issues that we can delve into this week, including whatever contemporary issues may be cropping up. Please don't hesitate to, put current events before the forum for the rest of the class to consider. Finally, I ask you to maintain civility. The likelihood of inadvertently provocative statements, making an inadvertently provocative statement is heightened when discussing hot button issues with people you may not know all that well. Remember that this is a two-way street. Rather than leap to take offense, ask some questions, beginning with asking yourself, why am I offended? Then try to engage with the person respectfully. I will be following along as I have been all semester so far, and I will continue doing that. If I think the discussion is transitioning from spirited to pejorative, I will step in and try to head it off. So let's have a great week of discussion and learn from one another.